This presentation aims to identify the challenges related to development progress as a result of armed youth destabilizing the Africa region. It explores the reasons why the challenge is difficult to address and suggests some manners in which the international community can tackle the problem. The population of youth in East Africa is continually growing. This is commonly known as the youth bulge. As more and more youth continue to face challenges of identity, masculinity, and idleness, the phenomenon is becoming a growing issue for humanitarian and development actors and governments. Efforts to increase development gains are continuously undermined by conflict in the region, resulting in setbacks and undoing progress that has been achieved. As resources become more scarce, youth engaged in pastoralist activities find themselves encroaching further upon the territories of other tribes, resulting in armed conflict. Such conflicts displace civilian populations, requiring humanitarian assistance to relieve the negative impacts experienced. Perpetrators are rarely, if ever, held to account. Youth who have migrated to urban areas in search of employment often find themselves manipulated by politicians for small incentives to create disturbances, violence, and intimidation. Many idle youth also join gangs or rebellions in an effort to assert themselves and their identity, feeling marginalized and ostracized from the mainstream due to their lack of employment opportunities and inability to contribute meaningfully to society. According to lifepeace.org, youth often play an important role in political violence, and the presence of the youth bulge has been linked with political crises, particularly in this region. Some of these political crises, such as the Kenyan post-election violence in 2007, the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, headed by Joseph Kony, from the 90s to date, but most of you will know of Joseph Kony from the Kony 2012 campaign. The South Sudan conflict in 2013, which continues to persist today. 2015 political conflict in Burundi, and also various ongoing conflicts that are occurring in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Having spent many years in Africa and bearing witness to political and ethnic conflict in South Sudan, I've interacted with many women and girls who have survived atrocities inflicted upon them by armed youth in particular. In addition, I engaged with armed youth to negotiate humanitarian access to conflict-affected areas for 4 years across South Sudan. Having built a rapport with various armed youth groups and getting to know them, I learnt firsthand some of their own challenges that they were experiencing. Many did not want to fight or felt they had no alternative. They felt trapped, isolated, and were unable to share other aspirations as they didn't believe the opportunities existed for them. Armed youth are responsible for grave atrocities, particularly sexual violence and abuse. These abuses are documented in various human rights reports covering conflicts across the East Africa region. The effects upon women and girls who survive such abuse also have long-term effects on wider society. As a result, I've taken this opportunity to try to understand more about the reasons why youth turn to violence and conflict and the efforts that have been undertaken to combat it. A great deal of resources from the international community have been invested in conflict, post-conflict, and recovery contexts. Many projects have been implemented across the region to serve the survivors of such disasters. However, there is very little investment in prevention or pre-conflict efforts to address root causes and mitigate conflicts occurring. UNDP promotes a human rights-based approach which attempts to address these issues specifically in relation to youth, which is outlined in their youth strategy. Whilst theoretically the proposed approach is a significant step towards strengthening work with youth, practical implementation, particularly in conflict-affected regions, has been limited. I've researched scholarly articles by researchers who had engaged with armed youth and groups such as Small Arms Surveys, Feinstein International Centre, Humanitarian Policy Group. I also reviewed policy documents such as the East Africa Youth Policy and media articles from publications from The Economist. After reviewing many different forms of research, I was able to start piecing together the different elements of the problem. I was then left with the question of why don't agencies do more with armed youth to detract them from violence? Through further research, I learnt that humanitarian principles themselves create challenges for assistance to be delivered to youth in conflict areas. Humanitarian actors cannot undertake projects with armed youth aimed at building alternative livelihoods or teaching non-violent conflict resolution. It could be perceived as rewarding youth for bad behaviour and contradictory to the principles of impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Such interventions could also encourage more youth to enter into armed groups or incite violence as a means to access assistance. As a result, very few actors engage with these youth, and therefore they lack opportunities for alternative peaceful activities. Through the research of one particular tribe in South Sudan, well known for its violence towards its neighbours, including child abductions, known as the Merle, I was able to map out the power dynamics that occur within the tribe to understand the negative and positive influences upon the youth. The negative influences upon the youth were all male influences: chiefs, elders, military, and police. It is clear from the research that male youth lack positive role models. Minus Fessa says in his recent article, The Nexus Between the Youth Bulge and Armed Conflict, that it's the lack of structural conditioning which is essential for transition from childhood to adulthood that encourages youth to commit violence. He believes there are 5 fundamental transitions: education, employment, new lifestyle, family formation, and exercising citizenship, which are all essential elements for the well-being of the youth. Without these transitions, he believes it would highly motivate young people to engage in armed violence. A youth's ability to demonstrate masculinity influences their decisions, particularly for those who do not have alternative means to play a role model to play a male role in society, providing for the family, earning an income, engaging in social practices, and community decision-making. Without such alternatives, youth are more likely to choose violence as a way to prove to others that they are men. They are also more likely, in such a context, to encourage other youth to participate. Through this research and power mapping, I've deduced that the positive influences upon the youth are very weak. There is an opportunity to empower these groups to have a stronger influence upon the youth and through them provide indirect support and assistance for the benefit of the youth themselves and therefore the wider community. As the majority of armed youth live in rural areas and oftentimes are nomadic pastoralists, there is a need for further outreach in order to implement projects that assist communities dealing with the armed youth dilemma. Additionally, communities with youth live within the communities the youth live within often have poor access to development. They have not seen running water, flushing toilets, tarmacked roads, or well-equipped schools. The lack of understanding of what is beyond life as they know it impedes them from making informed decisions about their own lives. If youth are not aware of a different way of life, it is difficult for them to understand what they are missing as a result of their behaviour and conflict practices. Alternative livelihoods enable youth to have choice. This ability to have options to choose a path in life would limit the number of youth engaged in armed conflict. Whilst education is critical and a right, educating youth about human rights for themselves and their victims is critical to reduce incidents of sexual and gender-based violence, ensuring social and cultural patriarchal norms become prohibited. Finally, the international community needs to find a way to work with armed youth that does not compromise humanitarian principles, to be able to see armed youth for what they really are, marginalised, ostracised, and manipulated citizens neglected by their governments. If the armed youth dilemma is not addressed, the impact upon the youth themselves, women, children, and society at large will be detrimental to development. The ability for East Africa to achieve sustainable development goals will be severely hindered. Conflict, displacement, and food security will continue. Sexual and gender-based violence will continue, and most notably by people with the least amount of awareness of basic rights and international humanitarian law. It is extremely difficult to hold perpetrators accountable for abuses that they have never learned or understood, and in many cases, consider norms. Thank you for your time and for listening to this presentation. I look forward to receiving your comments and feedback.